Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're talking about when we could actually see the Nintendo Switch's peak year. Now, the idea of the Switch's peak year is something that you could debate a little bit. Are we talking about sales? Are we talking about quality? And if it is quality, that's a little bit subjective. But basically, we go back to 2017. That year, pretty much almost indisputably is the best year ever in terms of quality of releases from Nintendo on a particular platform. They started things off with Breath of the Wild, then followed it up with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, now one of the best-selling Nintendo games of all time. And then we got Splatoon 2, and ARMS, and Pokken Tournament, and Fire Emblem Warriors, and Super Mario Odyssey, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2. All of that came within the same year, and I'm missing a few other quality games as well. It was a very strong lineup to start off the first year for the Nintendo Switch, and it all happened within 9 months, not a total 12-month calendar year. It was a very strong period of time for Nintendo. But then in the following years, that pace of release of quality content, of high-scope, ambitious games, decreased a little bit. It isn't to say that there haven't been good games coming out since, but it hasn't been as great. In 2018, the highlights were Smash Ultimate and Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. In 2019, Luigi's Mansion 3 and then Pokemon Sword and Shield and Fire Emblem 3 Houses. In 2020, we didn't really have too many big published Nintendo games save for Animal Crossing New Horizons and Paper Mario, the Origami King. I certainly left out a number of releases from each year that I just mentioned, but the point is, 2017 is by far the strongest year when it comes to those big quality releases that came out all within a certain period of time. And people have been waiting for another year similar to that, and we haven't quite gotten it yet. We thought it would happen in 2020. Not so much. Then we thought maybe 2021. Also, not so much. Not to say that these years didn't have good games, but when you compare them to 2017, they do pale by comparison. So then, when will we see that peak year for Nintendo Switch? Will we ever see that peak year for Nintendo Switch? That's what we're talking about today. Now, before we jump into things, let me very quickly talk about my social media. You may see a few different things here on screen. You can check that all out. It is linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, you can subscribe. By this point, I think I've made myself clear that when I'm talking about the peak year for the Switch, I am talking about software, the actual games. But let's talk a little bit about sales here. Because if you take a look at Nintendo's financials, they've been headed in a positive direction since the beginning, and they still are. We may not have seen the peak year for Switch in terms of sales yet. That time may have not yet come. And the reason why this is important is because we don't know exactly when the Switch's lifespan will end. Right now, we're looking at a situation where the Switch's lifespan will probably be longer than the lifespans for other previous Nintendo systems. Personally, right now, I'm thinking that the Nintendo Switch will be treated similar to the Nintendo 3DS. We saw the 3DS come out in early 2011, but we saw Nintendo published games coming out on the system all the way until 2019. Now, surely by 2019 it was very slow by comparison, but they were still releasing games, they were still releasing hardware, they were still supporting the system into that time, and that was basically 2 years into the Switch's life cycle. So what I'm getting at here is that unlike previous home console lifespans where it sort of ranges between 4.5 to 6 years, I think the Switch is likely going to have a longer lifespan than that, perhaps closer to around 8 years or so. And the way they're going to do that is, yeah, for a while the Switch will be the main system that gets the majority of the support, but in the later years, the last couple years or so, the Switch will be still getting some games, still coming out with new hardware, but it will not be the main platform Nintendo will be supporting at the time. So the Switch came out in early 2017. Let's say we don't see the next generation start until 6.5 years later, holiday 2023. The Switch at that point I still think will be supported, but it will be supported with games that are coming out on the next generation system as well. It'll get the same games for a little while, and there may still be another revision or two that are cheaper, easier to make, and are perhaps a little bit more comfortable for some people who do not want to buy the next generation system yet. And they'll do something like that for about 2 years or so. So the Switch will end up being supported until around 2025, which will be about an 8-year cycle. That would be very similar to the 3DS, and I think that would make a lot of sense. And potentially goes on just a little bit longer than that. I could see Nintendo pushing the Switch for a longer amount of time than the 3DS did, but even with the 3DS, there were a few years where I just felt like the system was far too dated. The system had a 240p resolution. It didn't seem worth it to me, yet Nintendo still supported it for a long time. So when you take a look at the Switch, and a lot of people sort of feel like the Switch's hardware is already sort of lagging behind a little bit, if you look at how Nintendo has done things, they haven't been afraid to do that, to use dated hardware and push it to the umpteenth degree in terms of support. As long as there are sales, they can get away with that. And if you look at the way sales are going right now for Nintendo Switch, they are still very strong. They're still trending in a positive direction. We may not have seen the very best for Switch yet, which brings us back to the software. Software supports hardware sales. That is just the way it works. When more exciting games come out, more people buy systems. That's what happens. People may not have bought the system yet, or maybe there's a collector's edition they want to get, or maybe there's a new revision that pushes that particular game in a better way. For example, with Switch OLED, maybe people want a more improved handheld experience to play Metroid Dread. That is a launch game with Switch OLED. So things like that will be happening throughout the Switch's lifecycle, as they already have been. And there has been a bit of a trend when it comes to releasing hardware and there being a nice sort of set of quality games coming out during that time. So if we go back to 2017, the launch year for the Nintendo Switch, as we stated earlier in the video, that is almost indisputably the best year ever by Nintendo in terms of quality games coming out with some decent scope. Breath of the Wild, Splatoon 2, ARMS, Mario Odyssey, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, it was a strong period of time to really push the Switch hardware. But then we go to 2019, where they released the portable version of the Switch, or the more portable version for the Switch Lite, which is also selling really well, and it's appealing to a very large audience with its cheaper price point. And there was a lot of games that came out during that period. It launched alongside Link's Awakening Remake and Dragon Quest XI's, a published third-party game that they sort of redid for the Switch. But then there was also a lot of other games that came out within a small sort of window during that time. Pokemon Sword and Shield, Luigi's Mansion 3, Fire Emblem 3 Houses, Astral Chain. It was a very strong period of time for the Nintendo Switch, arguably the second best sort of period of games that we got during the Switch's lifespan. Sure, there have been some bigger games that came out outside of that window, not counting games in 2017 like Smash Ultimate, Monster Hunter Rise, Animal Crossing New Horizons, but that period of time had a very steady rate of release of games that were of pretty high quality, and they all served to support the launch of the Switch Lite, and it has done very well since. So with this in mind, people were thinking that with the rumored Switch Pro that would eventually be coming, the Nintendo would support this hardware with a lot of really strong releases. People thought maybe they could see that last year in 2020, which is why there's a lot of speculation that we would see Breath of the Wild 2, or Bayonetta 3, or even Metroid Prime 4. Apparently, the Microsoft team thought those games could come out during that time. History has shown that that is far from the case. But a lot of that may have had to do with the pandemic. The pandemic happened in 2020, and a lot of things were derailed, a lot of things were pushed up, and we're not entirely sure how 2020 was supposed to have looked at the time. So people sort of assumed that, okay, with everything being pushed, 2021 is bound to be a banger year, where we get that supposed Switch Pro, right? Well, now that we are in the latter half of 2021 and we know pretty much most of the Nintendo plans for the year, there is no Switch Pro. What we have is Switch OLED, which is sort of what the reports suggested, but not entirely. Perhaps Nintendo was planning something like that at one point and those plans changed, or potentially that is hardware that's coming a little bit later down the road, or potentially that information was conflated with Nintendo doing research and development for their next generation system. It's hard to say for sure what exactly happened with all these different reports coming from reputable sources, but what we got isn't exactly what we expected. But it is a more expensive version of the Nintendo Switch with a bigger, better screen, and it is being supported by some pretty good games. Metroid Dread is coming out day and date with the system, and there's some other decent games coming out around this time as well. Pokemon Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, Shin Megami Tensei 5, No More Heroes 3, the next big Mario Party. I haven't mentioned all the games yet, but there's a decent lineup of games coming out on a consistent basis for this second half of the year. It's a pretty solid period of time. But if you look at the games that are coming out now, they certainly aren't comparable to the likes of Breath of the Wild or Super Mario Odyssey. They are on a lower tier in terms of scope and ambition and funding. They're great games, I'm assuming. Some of them have come out already and they're pretty good, but they are very clearly on a slightly lower tier here. Again, it's not to say that the games aren't good, it's just not comparable to 2017. 2021 still isn't the peak year for the Nintendo Switch. So when will we get that peak year? Well, now we're looking towards 2022. And I say that with some hesitation because I know we talked about back in 2019 how 2020 could be a big year, and in 2020 we talked about how 2021 could be a big year. Every year has potential for some really quality games, but it's very clear that the pandemic has pushed things up significantly, potentially more than a year for a lot of things. But either way, looking at what we know so far for 2022, it is looking to be very strong for Nintendo. Firstly, the sequel to the best-selling Zelda game of all time that, if you account for Wii U sales, is probably around 25 million copies sold, Breath of the Wild, that game, the sequel, is coming out next year. We have a release date, 2022. Now it's possible that the game is delayed until the next year, but right now Nintendo is telling us that they are aiming for a 2022 release for the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. That's already a very good start to 2022. But there's more. The sequel to Splatoon 2, another big game that came out in 2017 alongside Breath of the Wild, is also slated for 2022. But there's another game that's a sequel to a pretty popular game that came out in 2017 that's coming out this year as well. Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle came out in 2017, and now we're getting Sparks of Hope in 2022 as well. Those are three big sequels to three big games that came out in 2017, and they're all for 2022. And we still haven't even gotten our latter half of the year Nintendo Direct to sort of start to fill up some of those earlier parts of the year. And on the note of earlier part of the year, we are getting an open world game, or at least open environment Pokemon game, the most ambitious Pokemon game yet, Pokemon Legends Arceus, that's coming out to open up 2022 in January. Not a bad start. There's already some pretty good games that we know about that will be in 2022, but then when we also take into consideration some rumors that are widely believed to be true, for example, the next big Donkey Kong game and the next big Xenoblade game, those are both apparently coming out next year as well. That's some pretty killer content, I would say. We're already looking at a pretty strong, compelling year for 2022, and there are other projects that are looming that could also potentially come out during that time. Potentially the next big Mario game, although I'm thinking a little bit later. Potentially Metroid Prime 4, although I'm still thinking a little bit later, but maybe we see Metroid Prime Trilogy come out next year to follow up the momentum established by Metroid Dread for this holiday. And then of course there's also Bayonetta 3, which started development back in 2017, or was at least announced back in 2017. Surely that game is due for an update pretty soon, and 2022 could certainly be the release for Bayonetta 3. Potentially. And we still haven't seen what the Mario Kart ARMS team has been working on since ARMS in 2017. So, I'm not trying to say there's going to be like 15 big ambitious Nintendo games coming out next year, but there's certainly a lot of them. And when we think about games that we've already gotten this year, like Monster Hunter Rise and Shin Megami Tensei 5, it is starting to look like we're starting to see some of those bigger third-party games come out for Switch as well. There could be a few other major projects that we see next year. There is the long-rumored built ground up for the Nintendo Switch Resident Evil game. Maybe we see that next year as well. There's a lot of possibilities here, and even if we exclude all the rumors and speculation, just with what's already confirmed, 2022 is looking to be a very strong year, and at some point or another, we are going to have to see that second wave of big games. 2017 had a huge wave, and 2022 we already know about several confirmations of sequels to those big games. So it's looking like we are starting to see that second generation of big games that will be made for the Nintendo Switch in 2022. Which, yes, does lead me to believe that 2022 could be the peak year. Which has also led some people to speculate that maybe 2022 is the year we get the Switch Pro. I don't really think so. I think, as I explained earlier, it could have just been the Switch OLED and maybe some information was conflated with the next generation system that'll come out maybe holiday 2023, or maybe there were plans and they were canceled, or maybe they're still happening and I'm wrong. I'm not saying it's impossible, but considering that we're getting a more expensive SKU for Switch now, and Nintendo has waited 2 years between these different revisions, or 2.5, I'm skeptical that we'll be seeing something like that. But there has been a bit of a correlation with really strong software releases and hardware. So it's possible we do see another revision next year, potentially. Or maybe 2022 won't be as big as we think, and 2023 will be the peak year instead. Maybe that's when we see Metroid Prime 4, and the next big Mario Kart, and the next big Super Mario, and the next generation of Pokemon. That would all be really huge, and that would certainly be supportive of a new piece of hardware from Nintendo. And then another consideration is just that, hey, we're just gonna be getting good games throughout the Switch's life cycle. Some years are gonna be better than others, and it's not really that complicated. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.